Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Today Greg's going to be talking about application forms and just making sure they're complete. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. There will be a recording of this webinar sent out to you all within a week. Additionally, the webinar is posted on our YouTube channel if you want to access it there. As well, please feel free to post questions throughout the webinar. We're always happy to hear from you guys. Greg just won't be answering them until the end of the webinar. And now I'm going to pass it over to Greg.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, wherever you're joining from. My name is Greg Stanley, and I'm a Platform Solutions Manager with SmartSimple and part of the Platform Solutions / Business Support team. I've been with the organization for over 2 years now at this stage, and may have spoken to some of you in the past. Today, what we're going to be talking about is, as Sarah said, ensuring that your applications, your review forms, your report forms, or any other kind of forms that you're creating are completed to your satisfaction. So that all of the mandatory fields that you expect are done. Maybe your questions are detailed enough for the response or the question type that you're expecting. Making sure that all of the applications that you're receiving are within certain guidelines, maybe within a call cycle while the call is open, making sure that requested amounts meet are between the minimum or maximum amount of a particular call cycle. And advising your users as well of how far along they are in the process. So making sure that they're aware of what's expected of them and how much of the various forms are complete as well. So some of the problems that I'm sure you're all familiar with: blank fields, partial answers, requested funds in excess of what's allowed, and again, enforcing minimum maximum character word counts, displaying completion progress, marking fields as mandatory, and then specific complex rules. So we have a few ways that we handle this. So we have field specific settings. So every single field within the system can be marked as mandatory, so that users must complete or modify that field before they can proceed. We can also flag fields to appear as mandatory, so to encourage users to answer them, but maybe you're dealing with the validation of those particular fields in another way, like with submit logic or with smart check validation, as we'll talk about a little later. We have a new feature that was rolled out maybe in the last upgrade to display the user's progress through the completion of a form. So we can actually show status indicators and section completion progress on each tab as a user is progressing. We also include minimum and maximum character and word counts, again, to ensure that the questions are complete and detailed enough. All of these validations can include customizable error messages, again, on a field by field basis, or you can use our standard ones that are enabled by default. And then the final piece is that kind of complex logic. So some of our long-standing clients may be using submit logic for this. It's not something that I'm going to go into today because the new feature and new function of smart check has actually replaced that. So if you are still using submit logic, it's completely fine. Smart check just allows us to use a little bit more complex logic, and you can migrate from the submit logic feature to smart check, and maybe that's something you want to ask me about a little later on, or if you're unsure if you're using smart check or submit logic, we can go through how you can identify that as well. What are the benefits of this? Obviously, you're not returning applications for revisions. You can get straight into your review processes. Your reports that are being submitted, again, you can enforce all of these same rules on those. Maybe you're doing site visits, making sure that appropriate checks are being done on those site visits. Applications can't be submitted after deadlines have passed is a nice and easy one. And other things, ensuring amounts requested are within ranges, and other rules that can be enforced as required. We can do various checks against user profiles and organization profiles based on statuses or modification dates. So ensuring that an organization status is active, or maybe it's been flagged as ineligible, then they can't proceed with applications. Likewise, for individual users, we can also flag them as profile pending or pending review, and we can combine those kind of functions with other features within the platform as needs be. So I'm going to stop the share at this point, start a new share, and we will kick off with the demonstration. So we're going to be looking at kind of the visual elements first, how all of the things that I've shown you manifest for a user, and then I'll go through some of the configuration options a little later on. So I have an application form here that's currently in draft status. And as you can see, we have our status indicator here across the top of the screen. And this shows the user that's accessing the system where in the overall process they sit. So maybe it's draft submitted, then if they've been asked for revisions, you know, we can see the application progress through that entire process. One of the newer features that I mentioned previously during the slides is this. It's the status completion or the progress indicator. So this basically shows the user how much of each section has been completed by them. So within each of these sections, we basically calculate the total number of fields that are included and where in the process. So as we complete more fields, whatever, my poor words here, we can see that the summary, project summary, the completion indicator has jumped from 56% or from 40-odd% up to 56%. And again, as we go through more text here, again, it'll jump again. And when I save, the overall completion indicator as well will jump from the 36% to the 37%. And this is applicable for every single tab within the system or within the application form. As we proceed through, the values will update and change as needs be. And it is, you know, it's useful for users to see how they are progressing through that particular application form and through the individual sections. Now, some other items that we talked about, we can flag fields as mandatory. You'll see it displaying here with the red asterisks. And then we can enforce maximum word counts, which we have here. So we have 25 words left for our project title. We have minimum word counts. So we can see that I have typed 3 words here. But when I validate, you'll see that I have to actually put in at least 100 or 150 words. And then again, we have our maximum word count as well. We can also enforce minimum and maximum character counts. But I do feel that, you know, 5,000 characters, 2,000 characters, 100 words, 500 words, that's really up to you what you want to enforce. Now, how all of this manifests is we validate on the submission. So rather than on field changes or value changes or anything like that, when a user actually wants to submit their application, it will validate all of those fields on the form that's currently visible. So I have 2 buttons here. This one we use for demonstration purposes to bypass validation. And this is one that I've enabled today for the purposes of this presentation, just to perform all of those validations. So at any point, a user can save the record, and this will save the values entered in the form without running any of those validations. Some of you may also have a validate button on your application form. That will save the record. It won't change the status, but it will validate all the fields that have been entered. So you would still see the error messages on those validate buttons. And if you don't have them and you'd like to know how to configure them, that's no problem at all. We can talk about that in the questions later on. But as soon as I click on this submit smart check button, we see that we're presented with all of the errors and incomplete fields on the application form. So these items here, where we're seeing it cannot be empty or invalid date input, these are the mandatory fields. So when a field is flagged as mandatory, it'll display this message to state that it's empty. And I can hover over any of these fields and click on it, and it'll bring me directly to that section of the application form where that error has been generated. So if you imagine you're 95% of the way through your application form and you click that submit button and you've 100 questions to complete, it's very, very easy for your users to be brought directly to that particular section and have it highlighted for them without having to dig through the entire application form to find out where they've gone wrong, like I've done on my online shopping, leaving out my postcode or my phone number and having to scroll back up through the entire application form. Towards the bottom of the screen then, we have the more detailed validations. So we have all of the smart check values. So for example, the end date must be after the start date, so that users can only submit projects where the end date is actually after the start date. It may sound very, very simple, but if that isn't enabled, or if that validation isn't in place, there's nothing stopping your applicants or your users putting in a project that runs from last year, or that starts last year and ends, or starts now and ends last year. You know, another thing as well is our user profile is incomplete or has not been updated recently. So this is something that some of our clients have asked to be configured recently, whereas once every 6, 12, 18, 24 months, either the organization profile or the user profile will flick, the status will change back into a pending review or pending revision, which forces your applicants and your organizations to basically update all of that information before they can submit applications. They can still start new applications, so they can get through the majority of the process, but at least they know that they have to go back, you know, maybe ensure that their phone number is still up to date, their office hasn't changed, or what have you. And if we go down to one here, and this is the last one I wanted to highlight, this is the one that has the minimum word count. So we can see the field name, and it must be at least 100 words long. So if I was to paste all of these, 100 words into this, it will then allow for that error to disappear. So it's a very, very useful function and feature here. And other things that we can validate against, are the minimum and maximum word counts. We can validate against anything in a call. So I've just jumped into a program call or a program cycle here. We can see that it's open. So we can validate against, the granting year, the award total, the start date for the call to go open, any of these kind of deadlines as well. So if it's a single stage or a multi-stage, we can validate your LOI or your first stage against this date, and then your second stage against this date. And we can do that in a few different ways. We could stamp those values using a workflow, or we can do it on the fly, as I'll show you in the actual smart check configuration. So the reason I like to do it on the fly is it means that if you need to change or extend the deadlines, you can go into the cycle or call here, modify this and click save. Whereas if it's stamped onto the record, you would have to trigger a status change on the record to re-trigger that initial workflow. So that's something to bear in mind when you are configuring these things. So if we go back to our application form, I'm going to go into my configuration mode, and we'll have a look just at some of the options on the field. So how we enable these. These are nice and simple. So we have a simple text box multi-line field. If we scroll down, we have it flagged as mandatory. And we can put in the failed validation message and some custom validation as well on this specific field if we need to. We can also flag it to appear as mandatory. And this is where we would combine the field with those kind of smart check validations. So if you want to ensure that 4 checkboxes are checked in the example, maybe in the ages or categories or whatever, we would flag it to appear as mandatory, and then we would use smart check to validate against the actual number of characters and number of values that have been checked. And here we have again our minimum length of 100 words in this case. We could also put in a maximum of 500 words. If we disable the count words, it'll automatically count characters then as a result, but we want to count the words in this case. So those are the very, very simple field specific rules. The progress indicator is a new feature to enable, and how we enable that is we enable that through the actual application manager, so the UTA settings. So if we want to enable that on the level 1 applications, we go into the configuration, we go into the application tab, which is our level 1 records, and we scroll down to our form completion indicator permissions. And this is a very, very useful, very, very simple tool to configure. We can see the roles that it'll display for. So we have our grant staff, individual applicants, organization contacts, and system administrators. It'll display for all application types. So every program area it'll display for. And then it'll display in these statuses. LOI, draft submitted, revisions requested, and under review. You'll note that we have left out things like approved, declined, withdrawn, later review statuses, because maybe it's not relevant in those. Really, we want to see in this scenario, the applicants can see it from their draft statuses, And then maybe for the initial grant staff review at the submitted revisions or under review stages, they can see, well, they've only completed 80, 90%. So maybe we pass it back, or maybe there's something else we need to review in the actual grant application process to get to those stages and to ensure the maximum completeness. The same thing can be enabled, as I said, on level 2 or on level 3 forms if needed. And there will be some enhancements to come for that feature because it is a relatively new one. So look out for those in the next upgrade as well. Now, the last piece that I wanted to speak about is probably the most complex, and that is the smart check validation. So I know we always talk about, SmartSimple is configurable, and it is. The only place that we need to really use any kind of code is when we're talking about smart check validation. So this may be a little bit more complex than what you were expecting from today, but it's no harm for you to know how these things are configured. So what I've done here is I've configured a few different buttons. So we flag these with the BTN in front and then the button ID, and this is the one that we were talking about today. And these 3 buttons here operate the eligibility quizzes on the application. So we can perform different eligibility questionnaires against the different application types in the system here. And what we've done is, because we only have one validation for each of these buttons, we haven't combined them into a multiple validation check. So for our actual submit button here, what we have done is we've included reusable checks. So for example, start date, end date check, the maximum requested amount, the requested amount is positive so that it can't be negative, and a check against the user is active. So these are things that you would reuse in an LOI stage and also in the full submission stage and the revisions requested stage. So instead of creating a unique smart check every single time, we can create them and then import them for use on a single button. So if we have a look at the user is active to start with, so all I've done is I've included a nice little description here so we know what it's actually doing. And if we go into the source code, for those of you familiar with code, this is using JavaScript. So it's just a simple if statement. The result is going to be false, and here's the error message that will display. But if this is going over your head, what we include here is a nice little code builder. So it allows you to build very, very simple smart checks to say if, let's say if the impact value is blank, then the value is false, and we will show value is false. And we can add that directly into the source code as well. So now we have 2 smart checks in one in this particular scenario. So we have our original, so we were checking the applicant. The status is, if it's not active, show the error message. And here now we're checking the impact field. If it's blank, the value is false. So that's just the result of this. And you can build out multiple checks as you need. I'll show you that in the dates, for example. This is another typical one that we would configure. So here we're checking that the start date cannot be in the past. Now that may not apply for some of you. Maybe you allow applications to start within a calendar year or within a certain year. And then the second one is validating that the end date is after the start date. And again, these are a little bit more complex because we're having to convert into date formats and different things. But if you just want to check if a value equals this or if something equals that, you can build all of these different criteria into the source code builder. And then the last thing is, as I said, we combine all of the different smart checks into one, so that if something has to be modified, maybe you want to make changes or add in an additional smart check that's consistent across all of your applications. Maybe we're only checking the user is active here, but maybe going forward, we want to check that the organization is also active. we can create a new smart check in that master list just to check the organization profile, and then import it to the appropriate buttons or include it for the appropriate buttons. And what that means is then you're only making one change. You don't have to reconfigure hundreds of different buttons and add in all of the different complex logic. So all we're doing in the source here is including the individual checks, and then you can see it when it's compiled and resolved, and that it actually shows all of the individual smart checks that we were looking at previously. Now, how do we do some of the more complicated things like check the pull in from the program manager call cycles? Well, that's where we use things like list syntax. And again, this is a slightly more advanced SmartSimple function. It allows us to validate against values from another UTA directly from that submission or from the record that we're on. So where you can learn about those two features, there's the Smart Check Validation wiki article, which includes plenty of examples that you can modify on the fly for kind of basic or more complex validations. And then the list syntax construct as well for those is available in the web page view field wiki article. And again, this is also filled with some good examples. These are two of the more detailed wiki pages that we have. So that's everything from the demonstration that I had planned. So I see we have a couple of questions there, so happy to take them now.
Great, thanks, Greg. Can you go over the submission date again? The part about not affecting the workflows?
Yeah, so the way we handle that is through the smart check-in with the list syntax. So previously what some people would do is they would configure a workflow to stamp the application due date, the LOI due date, onto an application form. The problem with that is the application form has to change status for those values to update. So if we go to our call cycle and I say, you know what, I'm going to give people an extra month now, the end of October, if the application is already in draft or already created in draft status, and you make this change, your applicants, the value of that full proposal submission deadline is not updated on the application until the appropriate workflow is triggered again. So typically, that would be at the draft status. Those kind of stamps would happen. So if it goes to new application eligibility, then draft, that is where those kind of validations are stamped. But by using the smart check construct and the list syntax combination, I'll use the requested amount here because it's using the same idea. We can basically say, go to the cycle, find the appropriate field. So in this case, it's the budget limit total field, and make sure that it's, you know, within the appropriate range. And this check is triggered on the fly as the user clicks that button. So if you make a change a minute before the user clicks that button, it will reflect the new value that you entered into that field on the call cycle or on the program call or cycle.
Where do you find the call feature to set those items?
So the call feature would come in from a UTA. So this is a separate, so you may have an application manager or a grants manager or a submission manager, and you may or may not have a program manager to handle the rules around the application submission deadlines, call deadlines. Some of the more straightforward systems that don't require these complex logics wouldn't have this UTA enabled. So that's something that you can speak to me about if you're missing this program manager and you'd like to learn a little bit more. I'm more than happy to jump on a phone call or an email thread to discuss that a little more offline. But this piece is a separate UTA, so it may or may not be configured. And then when you're referencing fields in here, as I said, you would use list syntax within the smart check values.
Great. Is there a cost in order to use the progress feature?
No, there is no charge for the for this particular program indicator. That feature should be visible to anybody with UTA admin access. So again, you go to your main UTA, in this case, the application manager, you go to the level that you want to display it on, and then it's listed down here. Form completion indicator, there's no charge to use that, it's a standard platform feature.
If you want to check that all co-applicants have completed their collaborative task on the application at full submission, is this classed as a complex validation?
Yes, I would imagine so. It really kind of depends. So if the fields are only visible to the co-applicant and not to an applicant, then you can simply flag it as mandatory, and it'll just validate for that user that can see it at that point in time. However, if you are trying to do something around the co-applicant, maybe they have a separate form, a level 2 form, then those rules would be on the level 2 as well. And it really depends. Like, I think if it's just displaying and checking what a live user has done right now, mandatory fields or Smart Check can do that. If you are building in additional forms and when the application is being submitted, the co-applicant has to have done a co-applicant summary or something like that, then you would have to validate against the level 2 records, which again is something that's possible, and it would be maybe a little bit more complex, but something that support could definitely help with for sure.
Great. Is Platform 3 already active, or when will it be implemented?
Yep. So Platform 3 is currently live, and there will be new enhancements to it going forward as we move on through the next couple of years.
How did you connect the organization profile with the application to be able to include a Smart Check validation that they need to update their profile?
Yeah. So typically that would be done on application creation. So you can do that with the field itself. So on the organization field, if we scroll down here, enable auto assign company to this field on new records created by external users. So once that is toggled on, the user that creates the record, the organization that they belong to, will be set in here. And then we can validate against the status of this organization. If there is a status here, to make sure that the organization is actually active. Again, just using that syntax. So the organization and the user record would have to be directly linked to the application. But you can check, affiliated organizations or associations or co-applicant profiles as well, to make sure that everything is above board on the submission.
We have a couple people that have tried, they're testing the form completion indicator for an application. It's not showing like the right completion amount, like it should be 100%, but it's showing a different amount. One of the questions is being used as a dynamic field in another award type, but not for the type being tested. Is there a way to resolve it so that if they want to use the form completion indicator for both award types?
Yeah, there are a few enhancements. As I said, it is a new feature. So another example of fields not counting towards the completion would be the advanced data table. So any kind of XML tables, those are not currently counted towards the completion, but they will be within the next upgrade cycle or so. If there's something like that where the completion indicator is validating against the field that isn't on that particular application type, that shouldn't be the case, and it may be a bug. So I'd appreciate it if whoever asked that question could submit a bug ticket to support with details around that one, just so that can be investigated, because it should only be completing what is visible to the user on the page. So if the field is not displaying as a result of a dynamic option, so a radio button being yes and then the no field is hidden, that shouldn't count towards the completion indicator, and may, as I said, it may need some investigating.
Is it possible to validate a field for values within a certain time period over a number of records? For example, if a grant applicant has a maximum request over a 4-year period, can we validate the amount of funding received during that time?
Yep. So that would typically relate to kind of payment records. So we would do a count or a sum on the amount on each of the payment records. So if you're saying, the awarded amount is 100K and you can't give them more than that 100K, and you want to check what's currently being paid, you can perform those kind of checks by summing the paid payment amounts. So in this example, the payments are blank, but if we take another record here, have some payments. So with the payment amount here, we can validate. So if you try to change this from scheduled to paid, maybe it says, no, you can't pay it because you've overextended. Or, if you're trying to create additional payment records in excess of what's already been paid, we can validate those elements as well.
Are obligatory annexes to be uploaded counted then in the progress feature?
I believe that would be talking about the mandatory fields, and I believe so. So if we are uploading support material like here, and these files that have been uploaded or PDFs that have been uploaded later on in the progress, they should count towards the completion. So it would expect at least one file to be uploaded into those fields. Again, if that's not happening, please submit a ticket to us to let us know.
Great. So it looks like that's all the questions we currently have. Like Greg said, if anybody does have any further questions, like post-webinar, please feel free to reach out to us at businesssolutions@smartsimple.com. Like I said, we're happy to hear from you and clarify anything. Yeah, thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.